Welcome to podcast number 2 in our series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this podcast, we'll take a look at where the political and constitutional beliefs of the American Founding Fathers came from, and what historical events influenced them most. We have to begin our search in England. That seems counterintuitive because England has kings, lords, and medieval traditions. Yet understanding how England evolved constitutionally and politically during the 1600s is the key to understanding why Americans rebelled against the king in the following century. We start with Henry VIII. He was King of England from 1509 to 1547. He's probably best remembered because he was married 6 times. There's a poem that lets us remember what he did with each of his wives, and it says, "Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived." The popular image of Henry is a big, fat, obese king throwing chicken legs at the dinner table, and certainly some of the paintings of him later in life depict him as being quite obese, but he wasn't always that way. In his youth, we know from descriptions of him that he was quite athletic and he had auburn hair. He was good at archery and at jousting. He could speak French and Italian and some Latin, and he could also play the lute quite well. One interesting fact about Henry that occurred in more modern times is that in 1813, a workman working in the vault where Henry's coffin is stole one of his fingers and used it to make a knife handle. The important thing about Henry is that he broke with the Catholic Church while he was king and declared himself head of the English Church. And like most of Northern Europe, England became a Protestant nation. He also confiscated and sold all the church lands owned by the Catholic Church, which was almost a third of the land in England. And this sale of the church lands had profound consequences on England's social, economic, and political order. England, like other medieval nations in Europe at that time, was very socially stratified. At the top end of the scale, you had the king and the nobles. They were a very tiny minority of people in the country, but they owned most of the land and controlled the government and everything else to do with the nation. At the other end of the scale, you had peasants and serfs and others that we just generically call peasants, and these people had very little say in anything. And in between these two, we had a growing class of people that we generically call the gentry. This is sort of a medieval middle class. These were made up of lawyers, merchants, farmers, and local political officials. These people were the big beneficiaries in the sale of church lands. Most of the land that was sold ultimately ends up in their hands. They were entrepreneurially minded, and many of them wanted to progress socially up the ranks if they could, if not by having a title, by at least having a lot of money. And just like the United States is governed by a national legislature called the Congress, England also had a national legislature of sorts called Parliament, and like our Congress, it was made up of 2 houses, a House of Commons and a House of Lords. The gentry class, the ones who benefited so much from the sale of all these church lands, came to dominate the House of Commons within the next century after Henry's death, and they became the chief architects of opposition against the king in the next century. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died. James, a distant relative who was King of Scotland, came to the English throne as James I. James had an interesting appearance. His head was said to be too big for his body, and his tongue was said to be too big for his mouth, which made it difficult for him to speak, and also made it difficult for him to drink without dribbling. Initially, James ruled successfully, and he successfully navigated some of the religious controversies of his time. One of the grievances was that all the previous editions of the Bible translated into English had been translated with political motives in mind, and James authorized a fresh and thorough translation of the Bible, which we know today is the Authorized King James Version of the Bible. It's probably one of the most successful and widely distributed books of all time. But the picture soon changed because James had an older medieval view about monarchy. He felt that the monarchs were God's lieutenant on earth, that they ruled by divine right, and to rebel against a king he viewed as rebellion against God as well. This clashed with the English tradition against arbitrary government that went back at least as far as Magna Carta. In fact, Magna Carta was a list of things the king shouldn't do. Now, this didn't mean that English kings weren't autocratic and sometimes oppressive, but there was still an expectation, at least in England, that the king would enforce the law and not put himself above it. James also resented having to share power with Parliament, and he did his best not to call it into session whenever he could. When Parliament was in session, usually his relationship with it was stormy at best. One of the things that aggravated James's situation was that he ruled by showering gifts and titles of nobility and important government positions on personal friends and cronies. This irritated the nobility, who felt that they should deserve these kinds of offices. And because many of these, or some of them at least, were his male homosexual lovers, this offended the Puritan sensibilities of the House of Commons and many of the English citizens. James died in 1625, and his son Charles ascended the throne as Charles I. He ruled from 1625 to 1649. He continued his father's dictatorial ways. He didn't like having to share power with the Parliament. He was also resented because he married a French princess who was Catholic, and he went to the extra step of sending ships to help the King of France suppress Protestants there. That greatly irritated the English population. Charles's relationship with Parliament was certainly very stormy. Whenever Parliament met, they would often begin demanding redress of grievances and even initiating impeachment proceedings against Charles's friends and favorites whom he had put in high government positions. Charles usually responded to these situations by dissolving Parliament and sending them home before they could convict or do anything else. Without Parliament, it was impossible to raise very much money, and so Charles often resorted to extorting money out of people by demanding or forcing them to make him loans of money, and he even had people thrown in jail for not giving him loans of money. There's an interesting episode that occurred in the House of Commons in 1629. The members of the House got word that he was going to dissolve Parliament, so they forcibly held the Speaker in the chair and quickly passed several resolutions condemning Charles for the way he had ruled England, the way he was raising taxes, and his tampering in religious matters. After this episode, Charles would not call Parliament back into session for nearly 11 years. The problem for Charles was money. It is true the king had some sources of money that could sustain his household so that he could live a lavish lifestyle, but it wasn't enough to really run a nation, and especially not enough to pay armies, and he was frequently at war in Europe. England had no national tax collection mechanism. Taxes were done at the local level and were controlled by Parliament, especially the House of Commons. So it would really just be a matter of time before Charles would have to call Parliament back into session, but he did his best to delay that. Now, before going any further, it's important to talk a little bit about Puritanism, which had now become quite a powerful force in England. And as I mentioned before, you can't separate government and church or government and religion from each other at that time. The Puritans looked to the Bible as the ultimate source of authority. They did not look to the clergy or the Pope or the king or anyone else. They also saw no reason to owe obedience or allegiance to a king that they felt was wicked. Puritanism had become probably the dominant religion of the House of Commons and some in the House of Lords as well. It was very pervasive throughout England, and in some ways it explains why England was so ready to rebel against their king, which they did during Charles's reign. In 1640, King Charles reluctantly summoned Parliament back into session because he was in need of money, and they were in no mood to cooperate. They immediately began impeachment of the king's favorite ministers and government officials, his favorite cronies. Also, London streets had mobs that were unhappy with Charles's rule. And just to get an idea of how desperate the king was, King Charles personally led 400 troops down to the House of Commons with arrest warrants to arrest several members of the House of Commons, which did not go over well and probably destroyed any chance he had of reconciliation, even with the more moderate members of the House. After some bitter quarrels about several laws, including one that would have given Parliament control over the militia of the various counties, Charles left London and went north to York, where he began assembling troops and men and resources. Most of the members of Parliament stayed in London and began assembling their own troops and resources, and within a short time there was actual fighting in England, a civil war between the king and Parliament. Parliament eventually wins this war, and they capture the king, and they try to negotiate with him, and Charles was not one that would negotiate. He simply insisted that he had the right to rule, and eventually the House of Commons set up a court to try him. Several weeks before they put the king on trial, the House of Commons passed a resolution that read, resolved that the Commons of England and Parliament assembled do declare that the people are under God, the original of all just power, and do also declare that the Commons of England and Parliament assembled, being chosen by and representing the people, had the supreme power in this nation. This resolution is an amazing step forward in government. It puts forward the idea that the people themselves are the supreme power in the land, and that their representatives, since they represent the people who are supreme, are above the king. This turned medieval ideas of government on its head. A few weeks later, the House of Commons set up a special court and put the king on trial. Part of the complaint read that he had been trusted with only limited power to govern, but instead had tried to set up an unlimited and tyrannical power to rule according to his will and to overthrow the rights and liberties of the people, yea, to take away and make void the foundations thereof, and of all redress and remedy of misgovernment. Not surprisingly, the court that was set up found the king guilty of the crimes that he was accused of, and on January 30th, 1649, he was executed by having his head severed from his body. He was beheaded on the block. And Oliver Cromwell, who was the general of the army that defeated him and was also a member of Parliament, he was installed as Lord Protector and essentially set up a military dictatorship. The Civil War is interesting because it had effect in the colonies. In the New England colonies, which were Puritan, such as Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, those colonies supported Parliament in the Civil War. Whereas in the southern colonies, which at that time consisted of Virginia and Maryland, where there were Anglicans and Catholics, they supported the crown. So for several years, England actually abolished its monarchy. It had no king, although Cromwell's military dictatorship was in many ways just as harsh and oppressive, and they eventually did restore the monarchy. But in the meantime, many of the philosophies and political ideas that had been merely ideas began coalescing around political parties. In fact, two political parties emerged, the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories were supporters of the king. They believed that without the monarchy, society would degenerate into chaos, and there would be war and other disorders that would be worse than having too oppressive of a king. The Whigs supported Parliament. They believed that our natural rights or inalienable rights came from God, and that people only enter into societies in the first place to protect those rights that God had given to them, such as the right to have property especially, and that people have a right to rebel against government that violates those rights. One of the most famous of the Whig political philosophers was a man named John Locke. He lived from 1632 to 1704. Locke's philosophy deeply influenced the American founding fathers, and they were all well versed in what he said. Like the other Whigs, he had said that people have a right to control their property, and that that is a God-given right, and since natural or inalienable rights come from God, the government can't take them away. He also said that when people are oppressed by government, they have a right to change that government. Now, for those of you that are well-versed in our Declaration of Independence, or if you have a copy handy, if you read the preamble to it especially, you'll find that many of the things that John Locke and the other Whigs were saying are in the Declaration of Independence. So these were not new philosophies to Franklin and Jefferson and Adams, the principal authors of the Declaration of Independence. It's hard to overstate how important Whig political philosophy was to the American founding fathers. They drank deeply from these philosophies and couched just about all of their rebellions in the same language that Parliament did against King Charles I. There's one last important incident that happened during the 1600s that's worth noting. After the English restored the monarchy, James II, who was on the throne from 1685 to 1688, he was a Catholic. He was the last Catholic king of England. He wanted to impose Catholicism back on England, as well as to reorganize the colonies. We'll say more about him later when we talk about some of the colonies and his plans for them. He didn't stay on the throne very long. He was only on there about 3 years, and he fell out with Parliament. And rather than face execution as his father Charles I had done, he fled England, and Parliament invited William and Mary to come and reign as joint monarchs. This event is often called the Glorious Revolution because it proved that Parliament was the most powerful institution in England, that they could get rid of a corrupt monarch, and there was hardly any bloodletting involved with it. Between 16 and 1700, the political structure in England changed radically because England had changed. Powerful religious and economic forces had empowered Parliament while undermining the Crown. By 1700, Parliament, in particular the House of Commons, had become the dominant organ of government in England. The English government would later serve as a model for American government. But government structure was only half of the equation. England had adopted a political philosophy that placed responsibility on government to protect the natural or inalienable rights of the people. It also gave the people the right to rebel and to change their government when government failed to protect them. These traditions were transferred to England's North American colonies, and just as the House of Commons took the lead in rebellion against the king in the 1640s, so the colonial assemblies would take the lead in rebellion against the king in the 1760s and 1770s. In 1807, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to a friend, John Norval, and he made the following observation, quote, "But as we have employed some of the best materials of the British Constitution in the construction of our own government, a knowledge of British history becomes useful to the American politician." Unquote. For further reading on this topic, I recommend the following books: A History of England, Prehistory to 1714 by Clayton Roberts and David Roberts. The Oxford Book of Royal Anecdotes, edited by Elizabeth Longford. The Lion and the Throne, The Life and Times of Sir Edward Coke by Catherine Drinker Bowen. The Crisis of Parliaments, English History from 1509 to 1660 by Conrad Russell. The Trial of Charles I, A Documentary History, edited by David Lagomarsino and Charles T. Wood. The Tudor Parliaments, Crown, Lords, and Commons from 1485 to 1603 by Michael A.R. Graves. Puritanism and Revolution, Studies and Interpretation of the English Revolution of the 17th Century by Christopher Hill. The Glorious Revolution by John Miller. A Constitutional and Legal History of England by Goldwin Smith. The 18th Century Commonwealthmen, Studies in the Transmission, Development, and Circumstance of English Liberal Thought from the Restoration of Charles II until the War with the 13 Colonies by Catherine Robbins. Economic Expansion and Social Change in England, 1500 to 1700 by C.G.A. Clay. An Essay Concerning the True Original Extent and End of Civil Government by John Locke, and The Lamp of Experience, Whig History and the Intellectual Origins of the American Revolution by Trevor Colburn. The lute music for this podcast is from the Earl of Essex's Gaillard and was performed by Elizabeth Brown.